Preface and Introduction to A Short Description of Torre Abbey, Torquay, Devonshire. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Garth Burton. A Short Description of Torre Abbey, Torquay, Devonshire, by Hugh Robert Watkin. Preface and Introduction. Preface. The cost of a third edition of this book has again been defrayed by the owner of Torre Abbey, in order that the entire proceeds of sale may benefit the Torre Hospital. Further excavation in 1911, following suggestions made by the Reverend D.H.S. Cranage and others, which the author cordially acknowledges, resulted in the discovery of another entrance into the nave of the church from the Garth, the foundation of the rood screen and canon's stalls, and an interment, with niche for effigy in the wall of north aisle. The examination of the ditch on the north side of the church was completed, and a building adjoining the northwest corner of the church located. The foundations of the dorter forming the east wing were traced, and the level of the chapter house floor definitely established by the discovery of two tiles in situ at a greater depth than had hitherto been suspected. The foundation of the north cloister was found at one spot, which gave the width of the covering of this side of the Garth, which hitherto it had been found impossible to trace. The sites of the missing gatehouses were also examined. All these details have been inserted in the revised plan, the explanatory text corrected and added to, and the author once more acknowledges with gratitude the debt the public owes to Colonel Cary for his zealous care of and interest in the site of the Premonstratensian Abbey of Torre. First edition, August 1907. Second edition, September 1909. Third edition, July 1912. Hummersnot, Chelston, July 1912. Introduction. Torre Abbey, Devonshire, was founded by William Brewer in the year 1196 for canons of the Premonstratensian order. The abbey was surrendered to King Henry VIII on the 25th of April 1539, when the revenue was returned as £396 and 11 pence net, approximating £8,000 present value, the largest income of any of the 31 abbeys and 2 nunneries owned by the Premonstratensian order in England and Wales at the time of the Dissolution. In 1543, Henry VIII granted the abbey to his favourite, John St. Leger, who sold it the same year to Sir Hugh Pollard. In 1580, Sir Hugh Pollard's grandson conveyed the property by deed to Sir Edward Seymour of Berry Pomeroy. In 1599, Thomas Ridgway, ancestor of the Earls of Londonderry, bought the whole estate. In 1653, Sir John Stowell, of Bovey Tracy, bought part of the estate, including Torre Abbey. In 1662, the abbey ruins were purchased by Sir George Cary, of New Park, Hampshire, in the hands of whose descendants it has remained. William Brewer was descended from Rodolphus de Brueria, who held 6 manors as one of the followers of Baldwin of Exeter, one of William the Conqueror's generals. He had one son, William Brewer the younger, who died childless and was buried in the chancel of Torre Abbey Church, and 5 daughters. The founder of Torre Abbey was the trusted supporter of 4 English kings, Henry II, Richard I, John, and Henry III, and after taking a prominent part in the history of England, retired to the Cistercian Abbey of Dunkeswell, founded by himself 5 years after Torre, and in 1227 was buried before the high altar. The Premonstratensian order was founded by Norbert, son of Heribert, Count of Geneppe in 1120. The first house was established near Laon, 75 miles northeast of Paris, on a spot foreshown by the Virgin Mary, in a vision to Norbert. From the French Prémontré and Latin Praemonstratum, the name of the order is derived. Saint Norbert died in 1134, and was buried at Magdeburg, which bishopric he had held for 14 years. In the year 1582, Saint Norbert was canonized by Pope Gregory XIII. In 1627 his remains were translated to the Premonstratensian Abbey of Strahau, near Prague. At the end of the 15th century it was computed that no less than 2,000 abbeys and nunneries in Europe acknowledged the head of the order at Prémontré. There were 21 abbots of Torre. In the year 1500 the community numbered, besides the abbot, 11 priests, 2 deacons, and 4 novitiates. The present abbot general is Norbert Martin Scharginger, abbot of Schlagl Abbey in Higher Austria. There are 9 abbeys in Austria, 7 in Belgium, and 1 in Holland. In England there are, at present, 3 houses founded by the Belgian Abbey of Tongaloo, at Crowle and Spalding in Lincolnshire, and in Varley Street, Manchester, where the English head of the order, Abbot Peter Francis Goodens, resides. There are also 2 smaller establishments at Storrington in Sussex, and at Bedworth in Warwickshire, founded by canons expelled from France. The first abbey established in England in 1146 was at Newhouse in Lincolnshire, of which not even the name remains. Welbeck Abbey was the recognised chief house of the order in England. Torre Abbey was colonised from this house by the first abbot Adam and 6 canons, and was the 23rd Premonstratensian abbey built in England. With the possible exception of Wendling in Norfolk, all the 33 houses were built within a period of 85 years, 1146 to 1231. During the subsequent 300 years preceding the dissolution, none was added. The 716 years during which this site has been known as Torre Abbey may be divided into 2 periods. The 343 years during which the buildings were occupied by the Premonstratensian canons, and the subsequent 373 years as a private residence. End of Preface and Introduction. Section 1 of A Short Description of Torre Abbey by Hugh Robert Watkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Illustrated Guide to Torre Abbey. The Entrance. The approach to Torre Abbey from Newton Abbot or the north side was formerly by a much longer drive than at present, along what is now the Avenue Road, the entrance gates to which were at the junction of the avenue with the Old Mill Road. At the present entrance to the grounds of Torre Abbey are 2 modern lodges. The first stands on the site of a former pond, chiefly remembered by old inhabitants as the culminating scene of the annual Easter Monday revel, when what is called the ducking of the Lord Mayor took place, and a generally very inebriated Lord of Misrule finished his short term of office in the pond. This was probably a very old custom in connection with the celebration of Hoke-tide, when tossing or hocking, as it was termed, was indulged in. Hoke Day, Easter Monday, was one of the 2 days appointed in the year for the payment of tribute, and, later, tithes for the reparation of churches, the other term being the day of Samen, November the 2nd. It is possible, therefore, that at one time those who failed to produce the abbot's dues at Hoke-tide were thus reminded of their obligations by his bailiffs. This may have been the origin of a custom which the filling in of the pond, long after the departure of the abbots, has thus brought to an end. The second lodge is built in the line of the original boundary wall, which terminates on our left after passing the gates. With the exception of an old drawing made in the year 1662, when Sir George Cary of New Park purchased the demesne from John Stowell 123 years after the dissolution and destruction of the abbey, history throws no light upon the position and extent of the buildings. The two missing gatehouses. Leland, in the reign of King Henry VIII, wrote an itinerary or account of his travels, in which is a brief mention of this district. He probably rested at Torre, as he evidently visited the abbey church, and wrote in his diary, "In this priory be 3 fair gatehouses. Only one of these gatehouses stands today. The site of the other 2 has long been a subject for conjecture, as nothing now above ground indicates their position. As a result of recent investigation, it has been ascertained that when the boundary wall between the Abbey grounds and the King's Drive was built in 1877, the workmen found old foundations of cross walls in 2 places. So little was known then about the original buildings that, beyond marvelling at the toughness of the masonry, which, at these 2 spots, was partly utilised to carry the present wall, little notice was taken of the discovery, and it is only now, after the extensive excavations recently made in the rest of the grounds, and the knowledge thus gained of the general plan, that we are confident that these old foundations, X and XX in the plan, mark the sites of the 2 missing gatehouses. In the spring of 1911, excavation disclosed the strong foundations of the one gatehouse at X, 25 feet from the end of and in a line with the existing old wall. The foundations apparently run right under what is now the King's Drive. At XX, evidence of a building, probably a large shed, and a wall in which is incorporated part of a granite cider mill, were found. A gravelled pathway at 7 feet 6 inches below the level of the foot entrance of the modern gatehouse was also uncovered. If any trace of foundations of this gatehouse exist, they are at a considerable depth, and under the large trees which render excavation difficult, if not impossible. The Moat, Conduit, and Drain. On the left hand as we enter the grounds, between a row of elm trees and the ivy-covered garden wall, was formerly an open moat. The source of the water which filled this moat, and was thence carried by a covered conduit past the kitchen premises and straight to the sea, was the subject of a special charter from William Brewer the younger, who gave Ilsham and Shippy Collerton to the Abbey. The water came from what was then known as the spring of St. Petrox, adjoining the kitchen of the courthouse of Torre, and was subsequently augmented by other grants. Although the names of Effrede's Well, or Ye Side Well, near Torre Church, and the Shire Well in the Chelston Vale have come down to us, to which this grant certainly had no reference as they are mentioned in other deeds, the site of the St. Petrox spring and of the manor house of William Brewer the younger is still unidentified. The hard water spring, still to be found in the meadow adjoining Shippy Lodge, was the source of the Fulford stream, granted by Roger de Cockington soon after the foundation of the Abbey. The natural course of this water down the Torre Valley was diverted by the cutting of the railway in 1847. The introduction of the water supply from Tottiford in 1858, and the perfect sewerage system completed in 1877, rendered this provision of Torre Abbey's founders out of date. The moat and pond, already mentioned, were filled in, and the long, well-built conduit, along which a man can comfortably crawl, is now quite dry, and doubtless gave rise to the legends that underground passages from the Abbey existed in various directions. The West Front. The drive leads to the west front of the Abbey. The first building, surmounted with a cross of Portland stone, renewed during the recent extensive repairs, has been used since the year 1779 as a chapel. Until the opening of the Church of the Assumption in 1854, this was the only Roman Catholic place of worship in Torquay. Before 1779 it had been used as a laundry, and previous to the surrender of the Abbey in 1539 was the guest hall of the Abbey. South of the guest hall were the Abbat's apartments, now the modern dining room. Projecting from this side of the monastical buildings midway is the Abbat's tower, covering the main entrance. Beyond are the kitchen premises and yard reaching to the Mohun Gatehouse. Further on, at a lower level, can be seen the so-called Spanish barn. The crenellated walls were not part of the original design. Permission to build these was granted by Edward III in 1348. The wall on our left, through which we now pass into the garden, has probably been built since the days of the Abbats. The cemetery. It is difficult to believe that the ground on which we are walking was some 2½ feet lower when Abbat Adam and his 6 brethren from Welbeck took possession of the property in the year 1196. Recent excavation has shown that this was the case. A depression in this western side of the garden forms a natural arena, and this lower part was probably always cultivated as a garden. Under the alluvial soil the Permian sandy clay lies some 8 feet thick at the northern end. As we follow the pathway, we pass on our right a small modern addition to the building. This is the vestry of the present chapel. Just before reaching the end of vestry, pause, for you are standing in the west entrance to the Abbey church. Looking northwards, the ground rising above the depression just mentioned marks the west side of the cemetery, bounded on the north and east by a high wall. This, according to tradition, was for 340 years the burial ground of the canons. End of section 1. Section 2 of A Short Description of Torre Abbey by Hugh Robert Watkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Church. As a result of further excavation in March 1911, the foundation of a building running 43 feet northwards from the northwest corner of the church, and thus forming a western enclosure to the cemetery, was discovered. Although the width was quite untraceable owing to the lower level and cultivation of the present garden, it is probable that this building was symmetrical with the guest hall to the south of the west end of church. There is nothing to suggest what purpose it served. From the position, the building could scarcely have been one of the 3 gatehouses, but was probably further accommodation for guests, added simultaneously or subsequent to the addition of the north aisle. Forming the east end of the vestry are 2 buttress-like walls adjoining, but not built into, the west wing. These are all that is left above ground of this end of the church, and formed the southwest corner. The orientation or exact eastern position of the Abbey church was the same as that of Torre Parish Church, that is, due east by a magnetic compass. April 1907. The building was dedicated to the Holy Trinity, the Saviour, and the Virgin Mary. St. Norbert enjoined the cultus Marianus, or veneration of the Virgin Mary, as one of the first duties of the Premonstratensian order. Almost all the churches of the order were dedicated to the honour of St. Mary. It was longer than any other sacred edifice yet built in Torquay, measuring 168 feet, or only 7 feet shorter than the nave of Exeter Cathedral from west end to organ screen. The width, like all Premonstratensian churches not originally intended for lay congregations, was extraordinarily narrow, only 25½ feet. This was increased in the early part of the 14th century by the addition of a north aisle, which made the total width of the church 40 feet. A careful examination of the west wall of the north transept during the excavations in 1911 showed the broken end of this wall from which the newer facing had fallen, proving indubitably the alteration in the original work. Unlike many of the other churches of the order in England, which were much altered, the north aisle was the only serious addition, and the Abbey church of Torre retained its original simplicity of structure, consisting of north and south transepts, square east end, and tower over the crossing. Nave and aisle. The top of what is left of the masonry of the west entrance is 18 inches below the ground, and the floor, roughly levelled with pieces of slate from which the red, yellow, and black paving tiles have been removed, is 3½ feet below the present surface of the ground. As the outside level of the ground was 2½ feet below the present pathway, there must have been 1 or 2 steps down into the church. The proportionate widths of nave and aisle are shown in the ends of the 3 walls seen across the lawn, which now covers the body of the church. Outside the north wall of the church was a vallum or ditch, 19 inches wide at the top, tapering to 15 inches at the bottom. The object of this ditch, which descends to the level of 18 inches below the floor of the church, was to keep the building dry from the drainage of cemetery and ground which rises gradually to the north behind the church. In this ditch were found large pieces of the stone moulding of the windows, which the despoilers had not troubled to raise from where they had fallen. 2 small fragments of stained glass testified to what the windows contained. The ditch was further examined in 1911 and found to be strongly arched and covered at the western end, which was partly explained by the necessity of conducting the water under the adjacent building running northwards. The drainage was thus carried into the open conduit. The north aisle was probably lit by 5 windows, 1 in each bay, of the period known as the Decorated Gothic. This fact, and consideration of the ground plan, fixes the date when the aisle was added as early in the 14th century. In the course of search for foundation of the screen, a recess for mural effigy was found, with interment beneath, adjoining the north wall. Fragments of canopy and the upper part of a tonsured head in Beer stone were recovered, and, in all probability, this is the tomb of Abbat Simon de Plimpton, during whose term of office, 1330 to 1345, evidence suggests the aisle was added. Inside, along the whole length of the walls and the body of the church, ran a ledge of masonry, 14 inches wide and 10 inches above the floor. The object of this ledge was explained by the fact that the plaster, still adhering to the walls, ended abruptly 4 inches above the ledge, which had evidently carried a thick wooden seat, the plaster continuing under the seat to the floor level. The south side of the nave adjoined the Garth, or square, in which were the cloisters. From this, and the evidence of the masonry forming the junction of the south wall with the tower, the nave was lit on the south side by a clerestory, or series of upper windows only, so that the Garth should not be overlooked from the church. A door in the south-west corner gave access from the Garth into the nave. This was used for processional purposes, and would only be occasionally opened. In 1911 another entrance was found, by means of which the canons reached their stalls direct from the Garth. The foundation of the stalls was just traceable east of this door, and on the west side the base of the rood screen crossing the nave and terminating at the first column. Adjoining the south wall, and west of sight of screen, some 16 tiles, much worn and broken, were found in situ. To ascertain what form the colonnade took proved a difficult matter. The end of the centre wall of the three remnants above ground was first examined, and excavation revealed the well-marked base in bare stone and the bottom of the shaft of a triple column. The centre column was 13 inches, flanked by two smaller pillars 7 inches in diameter. Projecting from this, on the north side, down the body of the church, was a narrow strip of wall, 14 inches wide, 4 feet 3 inches long from the line of the front of these columns, terminating in some ornamental stonework which had been broken away. No corresponding wall ran parallel to it, but it probably marks a parclose screen. 3 small pieces of broken tiles, in situ at this point against the north wall, showed the true level of the floor, quite 3 feet 6 inches below the surface. Part of a capital with square abacus and floriated overlow, lying on the end of this wall, probably once surmounted the terminal column of the arcade. Having ascertained a similar projecting pier from the west end, the space was divided into 3 spans and the ground removed on the probable site of the first column. The excavation revealed a double tomb. Again dividing the distance in two, a single interment was discovered instead of the expected base. The inference that the column would be between the two was only proved by careful examination of the ground, which showed a distinct circle of hard, compressed clay filled in with loose rubble. From this space, doubtless, the bare stone base of the column had been entirely removed, and measurements showed the arcade to have consisted of 5 bays. The tombs accidentally discovered contained no indication for whom they were intended. The double tomb lying under the second arch was formed of 3 well-built parallel walls of about 1 foot in thickness, the half on the north side being 2 feet wide, that on the south 1 inch less. The excavation was 3 feet below the church floor, about 6 feet 6 inches below the present surface. Space had evidently been too limited, as a curious fact revealed. There was no head wall. An examination showed that it had been taken away and the clay end hurriedly plastered over. William, son of the last Roger de Cockington, and Joanna his wife subsequent to 1330, were buried in the Abbey church opposite the shrine of St. John the Baptist, which probably found place against the first column. Doubtless finding that the clay was sufficiently solid in the alteration made to the double tomb, when the next interment took place in the third archway, no attempt was made to use masonry, and the sides were simply thickly covered with plaster, on which 4 black crosses were painted. Unlike the other two, this grave was narrower at the foot than at the head, and 18 inches deeper. We have no clue who the occupant was. End of section 2. Section 3 of A Short Description of Torre Abbey by Hugh Robert Watkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Church Tower. The blocks of fallen masonry are all that remain of the south side of the tower which surmounted the crossing of the church. The north side and greater part of the structure must have fallen first and been taken away. Looking at the ruins from the nave or west side, the large block with 2 detached, formerly superposed pieces fell from the top of the wall on our right and originally formed the southwest corner of the tower. The arch, part of which can be seen resting on the ground, once crossed the nave. The height of this arch at the apex from the floor was approximately 38 feet, to the spring of the arch from the wall 25 feet, and the span 25 feet 6 inches. The side or transept arches were 19 feet 6 inches wide, and were thus narrower, smaller, and not so high as those over the nave. The transept arches were not in the centre of the north and south sides of the tower, but sprang from the east corners in each case, leaving a blank wall 6 feet wide to the west in the north and south sides of the crossing. This space would be occupied by the canon's stalls, which extended westwards to the rood screen. If we now view these ruins from the chancel or east side, we notice two detached blocks, which formed the south-east corner of the tower. The lower piece, lying nearest to the south transept, in falling rolled partly over and shows the commencement of two arches. The pilastered arch in the side facing us spanned the chancel, the smaller one, almost prone with the ground and resting on the step, formed the entrance from south transept into the crossing. The second block is turned almost upside down, the end now uppermost being in reality the base which rested on the first piece. This block shows us the design of the tower, which was square with diagonal buttresses 4½ feet wide at the corners, in this respect resembling the structure of the tower of Cockington Parish Church, the buttresses of which are smaller. Underneath is the south-east inside corner of the tower, and in the wall are to be seen recesses 10 inches wide and 3 feet 6 inches apart, which held vertical beams, part of the wooden support to the belfry floor. Access to the belfry was obtained from the newelled stairway in the sacristy, over the groined ceiling and under the roof of the south transept. The height of the tower was about 70 feet. The chancel. Only the south wall of this part of the church remains. The material of the other walls has been requisitioned for use elsewhere, and so carefully removed that only the signs of mortar remain in the ground to show where the wall once stood. As the subsoil is tenacious and firm, the foundations were laid very little below the original surface of the ground. The accumulated debris was removed from this part of the church to fill in the fish pond about the year 1770, and the present level of the ground is rather lower than the original floor, as shown by the stone coffin, which is doubtless in its original position in the centre of the chancel before the high altar. The coffin was made in 3 superposed sections of Purbeck marble. The top section is missing, and would be level with the surface of the tiled floor. The length, 6 feet 8 inches inside, suggests that the occupant was a man of no ordinary dimensions. We know from the cartularies or deed books of the abbey that William Brewer the younger died in 1232 and was buried in the church. The abbey was founded within 12 months of the return from Austria of the hostages for the ransom of King Richard I, and, as the eldest sons of the noblest in the land were sent on that occasion, it is surmised that the abbey was founded in fulfilment of a vow by William Brewer as a thank-offering for the safe return of his only son. William Brewer, the founder, and Beatrice, his wife, were buried in Dunkerswell Abbey. There can be little doubt, therefore, that this stone coffin once held the remains, and the lid was probably carved with the arms, effigy, or title, of William Brewer the younger. The south-east corner of the remaining piece of wall shows us the dimension of the east window, occupying almost the whole end of the church. The ashlar jamb of another light in the south wall is also noticeable. The remains of a buttress outside give the dimension of this window as approximately 7 feet wide. The succeeding bay would be filled with a similar window. There is no trace of piscina or sacrarium in this wall. The north transept. The east wall of this wing has been almost entirely removed, and great difficulty was experienced in proving the foundation. The absence of this and of the north and east walls of the chancel is very suggestive of the direction in which the stone was required. For what building is not known. Part of the west wall covered with trees and vegetation is all that is left above ground of the north transept. In the northwest corner of this wing the masonry is only just under the surface, and as the ground throughout the site rises gradually towards the north, and the debris from the fallen walls has at this point been left level with the ground of the former cemetery outside, there are consequently nearly 5 feet of wall between the level of the church floor and the ground on which we stand. This piece of wall is the best preserved of the whole edifice, as it still retains plaster and whitewash just as when the last service was held in the church. This fact seems to point to the destruction of the greater part of the building having taken place soon after the dissolution. The masonry of this northwest corner, including buttresses, measures 7 feet by 8 feet 6 inches. The north wall continues just under the surface for 23 feet, and there terminates abruptly in an irregular end. As no continuation could be traced beyond, a complete excavation of this corner was necessitated, and by following the level of the floor to where the clay and slate ended in the rubble of the removed wall, the second jamb of a doorway was traced leading into cemetery from the north transept, through which the canons would be carried for the last time. Of this northeast corner of the north transept only a small piece of the outside masonry remains. 6 feet under the present surface a small boar's tusk was found outside the wall, and inside, on the floor level, 2 adjoining pieces of red and black glazed tile. In the very corner were some of the broken fragments of a stained glass window. These, and other relics of the Abbey found by the writer, are, by the kindness of Colonel Lucius Cary, now deposited in the museum of the Torquay Natural History Society. The fragments of glass were so small and decomposed that it was impossible to ascertain the subject of the window, but from the character of the ornamental detail of the vertical shafting of a canopy, and the nature of the colouring, it has been stated by an expert to date from the middle of the 15th century. The line of the east wall of north transept was ascertained by excavating a trench inside the transept and following the level of the floor until it ended in indisputable signs of where the wall had been. Having reached floor level at this point, the writer was anxious to ascertain if the bedrock was far under the surface. Removing a little of the red clay, a piece of cleanly fractured limestone about 6 to 8 inches long was encountered. Adjoining this lay another piece, and thus a whole row running east to west. The fragments of limestone were neatly laid one above the other without mortar, and at the depth of 2½ feet below the church floor, and 6 feet under the present surface, the skeleton of a man 6 feet 4 inches in height was reached. The tomb was 7 feet 4 inches long, 2 feet 6 inches wide, and was not at right angles to the wall, but rather due east by the sun. The skull was exceedingly thin, dolichocephalic, with rather narrow frontal, and measured 21½ inches. Nothing was found with the skeleton to assist in identifying the tomb. 2 fragments of broken green tile, found in the sandy clay, proved the interment to be subsequent to the flooring of the church. Several pieces of finely carved stone found in the trench above, one representing almost a full-size hand, suggest a handsome shrine having once occupied this spot. Leland mentions that a certain Peter Fitzmatthew was buried in the church. As this is the only interment noticed by Leland, it is not improbable that his attention was especially attracted by the shrine. Peter Fitzmatthew gave Black Orton one of the earliest and most valuable grants to the abbey. There is reason to think, therefore, that this undoubtedly early tomb is that of this benefactor. End of section 3. Section 4 of a short description of Torre Abbey by Hugh Robert Watkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The South Transept. The South Transept, unlike the North, was divided into 2 chapels. The chapels were lighted by end windows and by a large window, 8 feet wide, in the west wall, the bare stone sill of which is 12½ feet above the floor. The height of this window from the ground was necessitated by the roof covering the cloister on the east side of the Garth. It also allowed the necessary space underneath for the staircase from the canon's dormitory, which was over the sacristy and chapter house. The entrance to the church from the sacristy adjoined the staircase. In proving this doorway, a well-made drain was uncovered, leading doubtless from the piscina which will be noticed in the south wall. 2 lines of decorative string course in bare stone are still to be seen in the wall of the south chapel, the upper line chamfered in its undersurface, the lower line is round. From many fragments found of different sizes, this decoration was probably general all round the church. Portions of the plaster on the wall of this chapel still remain. The whole church, including the stonework, was well whitewashed. In the centre of the entrance to the south chapel lies a stone coffin. Unlike the Purbeck marble coffin of the founder's son, it is of local red sandstone, formed of many segments, and is shorter. The length inside is only 5 feet 11 inches, that of the chancel coffin 6 feet 8 inches. The position of this interment suggested that the adjoining north chapel perhaps contained a similar tomb. On removing the gravel of the walk, on the spot corresponding to the position of the other coffin, only 6 inches under the surface lay a broken part of the skull and some of the bones of a powerfully built man. A careful examination of the ground showed that the soil had only been disturbed to the depth of 2 feet below the pathway. Removing the filled-in rubble carefully, the surrounding hard clay showed exactly the dimensions of a stone coffin. In a disused brewhouse, which formerly adjoined the tower seen to the south, lay a stone trough used as a mashing tub. The bottom has been covered with a thin cement and the sides roughly trimmed. The inside measurements are 6 feet 1 inch by 19 inches, the walls 4 inches thick. The stone has been identified as freestone from the Winspit quarry in the Isle of Purbeck. This trough, without doubt, is the missing coffin, and has been once again placed in the north chapel. One of these stone coffins probably held the remains of William de Buckland, who gave the land of Radcliffe in the manor of Buckland to the abbot and canons of Torre, with his body, and was one of the earliest beneficiaries to the foundation. Roger de Buckland, grandson of William, also endowed the abbey with the property Scobtor, but we have no evidence that he was buried in the abbey church. Relics in stone, the mill garden. In this south transept lies an inverted capital which may have surmounted the pilastered side of the arch. A flat stone, from its circular form, holes on top in which handles were fitted with lead, and incisions underneath, was once used as the top stone of a hand mill, or quern, the introduction of which into private houses was so strongly opposed by the monasteries. The religious houses, and occasionally the lord of the manor, held almost a monopoly of the grinding of corn. A special grant from the crown had to be obtained for the erection of a windmill. Blewett records that, contiguous to the fish pond was the mill garden. An Inspeximus in the Record Office mentions a watermill in the grounds of Torre Abbey in 1473. Tracing the course of the conduit already mentioned, the only possible water supply for a mill, the foundations of the mill building were found adjoining the trees by the gate of the railing separating the field nearest to the sea, formerly known as the mill garden, from that nearer the abbey, the east end of which was occupied by the fish pond. A block of granite, 3 feet by 2 feet 2 inches and 10 inches thick, with 3 incised circles, 11½, 10¼ and 9½ inches respectively in diameter, has attracted much attention. It is the only piece of granite in the church precincts, but like the millstones may have been brought from elsewhere. The weight of such a block suggests that it has not been moved far from the site where it was originally used. Granite does not appear to have been used in any part of the structure until more than a century after the foundation of the abbey. The block has only been trimmed on the side of the circular incisions, and therefore is not likely to have been a corner or foundation stone. If an erratic block, brought by ice during a glacial age and found in the neighbourhood, it may have been an object of reverence. The 3 circles are perhaps suggestive of the Trinity. Geologists doubt whether the granite is of Devonshire origin. It has been suggested that the stone was the upper part of a chrismatory. Sacristy, muniment room, and chapter house. The site of these buildings must be viewed with the assistance of the plan, as only a small part of the south wall of the muniment room is left above ground. The projecting stones commencing the arch which formed the slype to the sacristy can be detected under the ivy of the wall separating these buildings from the south transept, and just beyond are the lower steps of a newelled stairway. From the position of this stairway it is thought that it led through the gabled end, under the roof, and over the groined ceiling of the south transept, straight into the belfry of the tower, where the ringing of the bell or bells would be one of the sacristan's duties. This official or his assistant would be always in charge of the church night and day, and slept in the sacristy. A fireplace was in the wall adjoining the stairway. Adjoining, to the east of the sacristan's small room, a door led into the muniment room, in which would be kept the sacramental vessels, plate, wax, incense, and vestments of gold mentioned by Bishop Grandison in his register. One small doorway to the south communicated with outside. The chapter house or capitulum has been almost entirely removed. Here the whole convent met every morning to hear the public confession of fault, the infliction of penance, and information from other monasteries, and to transact the business of the abbey. It was occasionally a burial place of honour, as at Dale Abbey, but we have no evidence of interment in the chapter house of Torre. In 1911 a trench was taken out in the centre of the chapter house area, and at 4 feet 2 inches below the surface of the present pathway, 2 flooring tiles, one black and one yellow, 8 inches square, and about 3/4 of an inch thick, were found in situ, showing that, as at Dryburgh, the level of the chapter house floor was considerably below that of the Garth and church. Probably 6 steps descended from the entrance. The soil under the floor at this spot had not been disturbed, and seemed quite unsuitable for interment. The entrance to the chapter house, through which we now pass, is perhaps the best preserved architectural feature of the abbey ruins. The arched entrance, with 3 receding orders of decorative shafts and corresponding side windows, seems to have been the general design for this part of all the Premonstratensian abbeys. Dryburgh Abbey, in Scotland, is a well-known example. The crumbling columns are of Purbeck Paludina marble, and it will be noticed are weathering in longitudinal lines. The natural strata of this rock is rarely more than 7 inches in thickness. The Unio beds are thicker. They probably came from the quarries at Afflington or Affington, a flourishing market town in the days of Henry III, now a farm. The weathering shows the mass of Paludina carinifera shells, of which this deposit is almost wholly composed. The matrix of the rock is grey-coloured by carbonate of iron, which rusts from long exposure and gives the columns a brown appearance. The stone of the arch is thought to be from Salcombe. End of section 4. Section 5 of A Short Description of Torre Abbey by Hugh Robert Watkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Garth. The general proportions of this centre of the monastical life were dependent upon the dimensions of the church, and, in the case of Torre Abbey, measured 91 feet square. The Garth was a grass plot or paved quadrangle, in the centre of which was sometimes a fountain or tree, symbolical of life. In this case there does not appear to have been anything in the centre, and the square was probably grassed. To the north was the church wall, blank, with exception of a small door for processional purposes in the northwest corner, and a second entrance, discovered in 1911, used by the canons to reach the stalls. After much search, a small portion of the foundation of the north cloister wall was found 13 feet south of this entrance, showing that the north cloister, which would contain the carrels, was 4 feet wider than the other sides. On the west was the wall of the guest hall, which in those days would have no windows overlooking the Garth. The cloister. In the north-east corner of the Garth is a doorway, built in the wall of the south transept, at this point 5 feet thick, to withstand the thrust and weight of the church tower. This door was the canon's entrance to the church, and also was probably the only means of access to the dormitory by the stairway in the south transept. The outside arching of the doorway is smaller than the inside. The south side of the entrance is at right angles with the line of the wall, but the north side splays inwards. This, with the enlarged inner arch, was probably to allow the circular-headed door to open inwards in the thickness of the wall. The lines cut on the slate slab fixed in the wall are by the Reverend Joseph Reeve, at one time Vicar of Chudley. The exact shape of the stairway from the lower level of the Garth was difficult to determine. There were at least 2 steps up to this door. The tiled floor of the cloister on the east side was 1 foot above the level of the Garth, from which it was separated by a stone foundation. The remains of this wall are at one level, with no trace of columns, probably an upper tier of Beer stone, which has been removed, carried the support to the roof. A recess in the masonry, formed by a strengthening of the west wall of the transept, was probably used as the columna, with gradi or shelves, on which the manuscript books of the abbey were kept. The adjoining gap in the wall can never have been an entrance. 2 fragments of the tiled floor in situ showed that the arch is too low for such a purpose. The discovery of the drain, already mentioned, coming from the transept and passing under the pier, which has been since placed in the centre to support the wall, suggested that this was a lavatory, but subsequent consideration favours the probability that it was rather an aumbrey to contain books. Beyond the entrance to the chapter house, already noticed, is the arched exit from the day stairs descending from the dorter to the Garth. This has been closed with masonry since the Dissolution, and all trace of the stairway has been removed. The exit in the corner probably led into a slype, which in turn communicated with the rear dorter, the drain from which and old foundations of the east wing were discovered in 1911 and inserted in the revised plan. At Titchfield Abbey, the nearest religious house of the same order to Torre, this cloister, on the east side of the Garth, was the place of interment for the abbots. The first abbot of Titchfield was buried in front of the chapter house entrance, and the others in succession southward. Nothing we have noticed points to this site having been similarly used at Torre, and it is not yet known where the early abbots of Torre were buried. The southern side of the Garth, which formed the wall of the Locutorium and adjoining refectory with its sub-vault, is now almost obscured by additions to the post-dissolution mansion, built in all probability by Sir George Cary subsequent to 1662. As in the old engraving of that date, the site of the refectory was still a ruin. The Locutorium or Calefactory. The small entrance discernible in the masonry in the south-east corner of the Garth led from the cloister into the canon's Calefactory. To reach this room we leave the cloister by the doorway in the south-east corner of the Garth, and passing a large circular buttress, supporting the badly built addition to the house, gain the entrance at the back of the east wing. This entrance to the Calefactory did not exist in the canon's days. A small built-up doorway in the south wall, to the left on entering, was probably used by the lay brother to bring in fuel for the fire. The site of the fire, which gave to this apartment the name of Calefactory, can be traced in the east wall to the right on entering. In this room alone could the strict rule of silence be relaxed, by which it was also known as the Locutorium or room of conversation. The roof was groined, and there was no second story, as it would have interfered with the large window, generally circular, in the east end of the refectory. The refectory sub-vault. There was no communication between the Locutorium and the refectory sub-vault into which we next enter. The partition walls are modern, and this was originally one vault of 4 double bays. The groined roof was supported on 3 bare stone pillars with Purbeck capital and base. 2 of these pillars were built in and hidden by the cross walls. One has been again exposed. This vault was formerly lit by 4 lights, one in each bay, on the north side from the Garth. The end window has been converted into a stairway, now closed, which formerly communicated with the butler's room. The entrance to this vault was on the south side, in the second bay from the east end, immediately under where the pulpit of the refectorium would be placed in the wall, as at St. Agatha's, Easby, Yorkshire. The site of the pulpit is now occupied by the entrance to the residence. Windows originally occupied the first and third bays, and in the fourth the appearance of the masonry suggests a lavatory recess for washing. This sub-vault was not improbably used as a school in which the novitiates were taught. The west end wall is part of a mass of masonry 12 feet in thickness, formed by an addition each side to the original partition wall, to form a base for the Elizabethan chimneys. The Cellarer's store. To reach the other side of the 12 feet thick wall we must cross the Garth, pass the modern wings and additions which almost cover the southern half of the quadrangle, and by a circuitous route through the basements once more reach the continuation of the refectory sub-vault. These 2 bays, from their position, were doubtless used as the Cellarer's store. 2 of the original windows, although closed by masonry, give a very good idea of what these sub-vault windows were like. The entrance, now closed, appears to have been again on the south side in the west bay. The 2 doorways, at present open, have been since broken through. There was, originally, no access to the refectory sub-vaults from the Garth. The wall dividing the Cellarer's store was also not part of the original plan, although probably of earlier date than the similar walls in the school of the novitiates. End of section 5. Section 6 of A Short Description of Torre Abbey by Hugh Robert Watkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The southwest corner of the Garth. This corner, now covered by modern staircase leading to the second story of the house, is interesting on account of the remains of the lavatories at which the canons washed before going into meals. The base of an ornamental column and a fragment of dog-tooth ornament are, fortunately, left in the south wall to show the site of one lavatory. The other lavatory is in the west wall, the arch being bisected by the modern staircase wall. The more ornamental lavatory would probably be used by the canons, that in the west wall by the lay brethren and novitiates. The position of these lavatories gives a clue to the site of the staircase, or grease, as it was called, which led up to the refectory. This was situated in the corner between the lavatories. The line of the stairway against the west wall could recently be detected, and, as at other houses of the order, was probably of iron or wood. Although all trace is obliterated by modern structures, there is little doubt that the cloister extended along the south side of the Garth, and protected the site of the lavatories and the main entrance beyond. The wall of the guest hall and north side adjoining the church were also proved in 1911 to have been covered. The Volta. This name, Volta, is derived from an old description of the sister house of Titchfield, now in the library of the Duke of Portland at Welbeck. The doorway through which we now enter from the southwest corner of the Garth, as already stated, was not part of the monastical plan, as this wall outside was occupied by the stairs to the refectory. The original means of exit at this end can be traced in the south wall of the Volta on our left, and led, if not into the kitchen premises, into an adjoining slype. The Volta was a sub-vault under the Abbat's apartments, and consisted of 3 double bays. The groined roof is supported on 2 central columns of bare stone, with roughly moulded Purbeck capital and base, as in the school of the novitiates. The Volta was used for the accommodation of the retinue and attendants brought by the more important guests, and for the more humble visitors who enjoyed the abbey's hospitality, refused to none for the regulation night and day, after which period the traveller was expected to pay for his entertainment. This hall was lighted by 1 window in the east wall and 3 in the west wall. The window nearest to the Abbat's tower, with rounded head and dripstone course, has fortunately been preserved in its original form. In the southwest corner of the Volta, a narrow way through the wall leads to a newelled stairway, which has only recently been uncovered, and was doubtless the means of communication between the Abbat's apartments and the kitchen premises. This stairway did not form part of the original monastical plan, and was probably added by one of the later abbots. The north-east corner is filled by a clumsily constructed buttress, for which no cause is apparent, and the object of which cannot be conjectured, unless it was at one time intended to put a fireplace in the corner above it. The recess and hole through the east wall were for the water pipes which supplied the lavatory on the outside. Sub-vault of Guest Hall. The roof of this undercroft is supported in the centre by 2 massive piers of Purbeck Portland stone, which, from their exceptional hardness, probably came from the disused quarry at Tilly Wim, abandoned, it is thought, on this account. The one pier is roughly rectangular, the other has been trimmed to an octagon. From the fact that these piers differ from those in the other vaults, it has been suggested that they may have been taken from a still older building. This undercroft was probably, in the Abbey days, never anything but a store, although some underground sand-filled flues, in which was found charcoal in the northwest end bay, point to a stove or oven for baking purposes having once occupied this spot. The position and shape of the southernmost of the three windows in the west wall has been somewhat altered by the subsequent erection of the entrance stairway to the Abbat's tower. Provision was made for two doorways into this undercroft, one at the south end of each series of bays. Only the one nearest the Garth is now open. The threshold of this doorway appears to be an attempt at, if not actually, the head-end stone of a coffin, of the same local red sandstone as the one in the south transept. West side of Garth. When the old plaster was recently removed from the outside of the wall, above the elevated covered passage built for communication from the house to the chapel, two stone window frames in the masonry were uncovered. The floor levels of this building have been altered to accommodate a lofty dining room, which occupies what were 2 stories, and formed the Abbat's apartments. The upper story, in the days when the rites of Roman Catholicism were interdicted in this country, was used as a secret chapel. Part, if not all this upper chamber would be the Abbat's bedroom, and the small oriel window just under the eaves of the roof, looking towards the church, was in all probability used for the private devotions of the successive abbots of Torre. Perhaps from this very aperture Simon Reed looked for the last time, on the 25th of April, 1539, before surrendering his church and abbey to the officials of Henry VIII. The windows were again plastered over during the repairs effected in 1906, but in the year 1909 Colonel Cary had these interesting relics once more exposed and restored, which manifestation of care for this historic building will be much appreciated by the thoughtful to whom such monuments of the past appeal. Projecting from the wall of the guest hall, under one of the modern windows of the present chapel, is the back of the fireplace, corbelled 1 foot from the face of the wall. The fireplace was a characteristic feature of the guest hall of a monastery, as well as of the Calefactory. Previous to the insertion of the window, this corbelled chimney was continued to the roof. Instances of such 12th century work are now rare, and it is to be regretted that a buttress has been recently built up to it underneath. The outside of this fireplace was recently covered by a creeping plant, the roots of which were in the floor of the undercroft, inside. End of section 6. Section 7 of A Short Description of Torre Abbey, by Hugh Robert Watkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The entrance to the Garth was through the present subway, level with the undercrofts and originally little, if at all, below the level of the outside ground. The walls partitioning off the undercrofts from the passageway are thinner than the main walls of these west buildings, which are nearly 5 feet thick at the ground. The basement of the Abbat's tower, projecting from the west wing of the abbey, formed the main entrance to the seclusion of the Garth and canons' quarters. The walls on each side of the entrance have recessed seats, where wayfarers, seeking rest and shelter for the night, would be interviewed by the prior or cellarer, or the poor sat waiting for the remnants of the canon's repast. The Abbat's Tower. The first story is reached by a stairway adjoining the north side. As the level of the road, as shown by excavation, was originally 2½ feet lower than at the present day, and the lighting of the guest hall and undercroft have both been altered in this corner, There is little doubt that this was not the original means of access to the guest hall and abbot's quarters. From a slight thickening of the masonry on the right-hand side of the basement entrance, the stairway may have been placed at this point, and the doorway probably in the south side of the tower. A lavatory with ogee arch is in the north wall of the guest's entrance. This is obviously of the same date as the doorway into the hall. The second storey is now reached by means of the staircase leading from the first floor of the tower to the dining room through a doorway made in the south side of the tower. In the 3 feet thickness of the wall, 3 high steps of local conglomerate stone have been inserted. This doorway, like the staircase, is modern, and the chamber, doubtless the abbot's study, as well as the third storey which now contains the clock, were connected by a newelled stairway in the south-east corner of the tower direct with the abbot's rooms. This well-worn circular stairway bears the marks of much usage, and the steps, with lift of about 10 inches, have been repaired with slate. It was originally built of conglomerate rock, an unsuitable material, but which attests its age, as beer stone and granite were used later. The stairs now only lead from the floor of the second storey, but the structure of the steps, deviation of the line of wall below just inside the ogee-arched entrance into former guest hall, and a recess in the wall of adjoining pantry, show indubitably that these stairs connected the upper rooms of the tower with the abbot's apartments. The tower underwent complete repair in 1874, when the floors were renewed and the second storey panelled. The newelled stairway originally led direct onto the roof. The top of the tower has been repaired with bricks, and the stairway is now closed by a wooden trapdoor. A chimney has at one time been inserted in the east wall, and a fireplace of Ham Hill stone put in the second storey. The bell, on which the clock now strikes, was formerly rung in a small wooden belfry on the roof, by rope from the first storey. The hole in the ceiling through which the rope ascended can be seen just inside the ogee-arched entrance. The bell is 13½ inches in diameter at the mouth, with a depth of 9½ inches. The original eye cast in the bell, by which it was suspended, has been broken, and it is now hung on 2 wrought iron loops bolted to a rocking beam. There is a legend that the bell was taken from one of the vessels of the Spanish Armada. From its size, it may have been a ship's bell, but the old clapper, now hanging useless, has no ring or fastening for lanyard. This theory is further refuted by an inscription on the bell in Old English characters. The lettering in the mould appears to have been misposed, so that the inscription probably reads reversed, as on one of the church bells at Kennerley. Many of the old church bells in Devonshire have been recast, but there are some 34 with inscriptions in Old English lettering more or less undecipherable, and there is little doubt that this is one of the Abbey bells. The tone is thin but silvery, and from the fact that this bell alone has been preserved from the dissolution of the Abbey, it is probable that it always hung in this tower, and thus escaped the destruction of the church bells. It may have summoned the canons, lay brethren, and guests to meals, and, possibly, sounded the curfew. The modern chapel. When used as the guest hall, this building contained no gallery as now, and extended over the passage in the basement. The ogee-arched entrance thus opened direct into the hall. This is further proved by the position of the fireplace, which would, then, be in the centre of the east wall. The walls have been thickly covered with lath and plaster, and an apse of this material surmounts the altar, behind which steps in the wall lead down into the vestry. The carved wooden bosses at the intersections of the ceiling ribs are probably the only portions of the room, now visible, which antedate its conversion to a chapel in 1779. The altar crucifix, standing on a white marble representation of tomb, is probably of Swiss workmanship. The 6 candlesticks are of local marble, in which the embedded corals are beautifully shown. The chapel contains several mural tablets, the earliest erected to the memory of George Cary, Esquire, who died December 1st, 1805, and of Cecilia, his wife, August 30th, 1779, the year the chapel was dedicated. The visitor will regard with reverence and sympathetic thought the beautiful piece of marble with gilded letters and frame inscribed to the memory of Lieutenant Henry J. L. Cary, of the Devonshire Regiment, dearly loved only son of Colonel Lucius Cary, of Torre Abbey, and of Bertha, his first wife. He died in South Africa, 2nd of January 1901, during the Boer War, in his 29th year. Rest in peace. End of section 7. Section 8 of a short description of Torre Abbey, by Hugh Robert Watkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mohun Gatehouse. The position of this gatehouse is very noticeable. It stands at an angle altogether out of harmony with the rest of the monastical buildings, which are all parallel and in accordance with the orientation of the church. The natural inference is that this gatehouse and the adjoining long building, which occupied the site of foundations shown in the plan, were standing before the canons came into possession of the property in 1196. In the old engraving of 1662, this building is marked as the Old Gatehouse, whereas the one other of the missing two, although sketched in an impossible position, is called the Gatehouse on ye west side of ye Abbey, by which is doubtless meant that marked X in the plan. If the artist can be relied upon, the present gatehouse, although the oldest of the three, has therefore outlasted the others. Recent investigation and the evidence of architectural detail show that what we have named the Mohun Gatehouse was erected between the years 1310 to 1330, but certainly occupies the exact site of a still older gatehouse, which explains its position. The building covers 2 entrances, one wide enough for vehicles and a smaller footway. In the first bay of the larger entrance, on the centre keystone of red sandstone, are the arms of Torre Abbey, a chevron between 3 pastoral staves. Oliver tells us that these were formerly mistaken for 999. In the second bay is the simple device of the founder, William Brewer, described in heraldry as "gules with 2 bends undi or," which means that the bends or wavy lines were in gold on a red background. On the right-hand side as we enter, on the first bracket from which the vaulting rib springs, is a rather indistinct design. On the sinister of the shield are the original arms of the Mohun family of Dunster, a hand habited in maunch grasping a fleur-de-lis. The blank dexter probably signifies the connection of this family with that of William Brewer by marriage. Alicia, the 4th daughter of the founder of Torre Abbey, married Reginald de Mohun, her father's ward, to whom she brought the manor of Torre Brewer, afterwards known as Torre Mohun. On the second bracket is an eagle displayed. This has been misinterpreted by Oliver and others as the arms of the Speke family, which were 2 crossbars and a 2-headed eagle. It is in reality the seal adopted by John, son of Richard de Mohun, in the reign of Henry III. On the first bracket of the second bay is a shield on which is a cross engrailed. John de Mohun III, as he was known to distinguish him from 2 ancestors, who died in 1330 at the approximate age of 45, changed the ancient arms of the hand bearing the fleur-de-lis to a gold shield with sable cross engrailed. This is the device on this bracket, and was certainly not known before the year 1310. The succeeding John de Mohun, last Lord Mohun of Dunster, altered the device by cutting the engrailment through, making the cross a series of diamonds or lozenges. This device is not on the gatehouse, and would, it is thought, undoubtedly have found a place if the gatehouse had been built subsequent to the year 1330. The canons' masons seem to have run short of heraldic designs, as on the fourth and last bracket they have repeated the 3 pastoral staves of the Abbey arms. On the left side of this entrance is only one attempt at decoration, on the end bracket, a large trefoil, the significance of which is not known. The keystones in the smaller passage are incised with 2 circles or wheels of 8 spokes. The interstices have in the first bay 2 dagger-like forms, 3 triangles, and 3 blank spaces. In the second bay there are 2 of each incised form and 4 blank spaces. The interpretation of these cabalistic signs is not known. They probably had some signification. The porter's lodge, on the south side, occupied the space not appropriated by the entrances on the ground floor of the gatehouse. This chamber, only 17 feet by 9 feet, is lit by 2 small windows looking east and west through the 4 feet thick walls. A cresset bracket of stone in the wall has the appearance of having been carved. A newelled staircase of granite in the south-east tower leads to the upper stories and the roof. On the first floor the room, owing to the height of the carriageway, only extends half the width of the building, and measures 16 feet 9 inches by 15 feet. In the south wall there is a fireplace. A small stone bracket held the cresset. A recess in the north wall formed a cupboard about 5 feet from the ground. In the south-west corner a narrow low doorway led into the turret, where a larger doorway, now filled with masonry, formerly opened into the upper story of the long building adjoining. The second floor, which extends over the carriageway, forms a much larger room. A fireplace, which had been plastered over, once occupied the centre of the north wall. A small recess in the south wall, 4½ feet from the entrance and 4 feet 4 inches from the floor, appears to be all the cupboard accommodation the room contained, with the possible use of both north-west and south-west corner towers, into which small doorways lead. On the removal of the ceiling of this room in 1906, some remains of the stucco decoration were revealed above the level of the lath and plaster, which shows this chamber to have been of some importance. Not improbably it was the prior's parlour. The prior, who was known previous to the year 1294 as Decanus or Dean, kept the keys of the entrances at night, and was more directly in charge of the canons and lay brethren than the Abbat, whose duties frequently necessitated his absence to attend general chapters and other gatherings of the chief dignitaries of the land. In the north-east corner of this upper room, when the wall was broken through, a narrow passage led to the second floor of the main building, descending some 7 feet by means of a steep staircase. This awkward connection between the buildings, and the fact that the west wall of the kitchen premises has been carried at least 6 feet out of true parallel, in order to meet this north-east corner of the gatehouse, show that this building antedates the wing, and that, in the original plan of the Abbey, there was no intention of connecting the gatehouse with the main building. The design occupies a small place in the borough arms of Torquay, and is unique among the remaining Abbey gateways in this country. The Forden. The material of the adjoining long building has been removed for use elsewhere, and there is scarcely any rubble in the soil covering the foundations, which lie some 2 feet under the ground. From the dimensions of this building, convenience for drainage, proximity to the barn for fodder, and the necessity for large accommodation for the horses of visitors with their numerous retinue, it is conjectured that the lower story was the fordon or fold for stabling. The floor above would be occupied by the lay brethren who did the menial work of the abbey and looked after the numerous livestock. An inventory of Titchfield Abbey, made in the year 1420, mentions 48 horses, and gives the total number of the quadrupeds owned by the abbey as 1,440. End of section 8. Section 9 of a short description of Torre Abbey by Hugh Robert Watkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Norman Aula. The east wall of the cemetery terminates at its south end against, but is not built into, the north wall of a ruined building. The significance of this fact is that the building was there before the wall was erected. The enclosure of the cemetery, as we learn from the records of Dryburgh Abbey, was one of the first duties of the canons. From the material and nature of the cemetery wall of Torre Abbey, there is no reason to doubt that it dates from the foundation of the abbey. The adjoining building is therefore older than the abbey. The position of this east aula or hall, as proved by recent investigation and shown in the plan, was altogether out of alignment with the walls of the adjoining muniment room and rest of the abbey, but was parallel with the series of buildings on the west side, which we have just considered. The very ancient-looking cross walls, with round archways, only descend some 6 inches under the surface, and are comparatively modern. Only the north wall and the north end of the east wall of the old building remain above ground. A cornice or inside string course of stone suggests that the room was 14 feet high. The north wall contained a window 7 feet wide, the sill of which must have been 10 feet above the level of the floor. Excavation to a depth of 6 feet showed that a quantity of boulders had been laid in the ground, and the north wall, although 3 feet 3 inches thick, was strengthened inside as well as out by additional buttresses 2 feet thick, thus forming masonry over 7 feet in thickness to carry a wall 14 feet high. These precautions were explained by the nature of the subsoil, which, though now quite dry, was doubtless once saturated with water. The site has now for centuries been drained by a well, which adjoins this building. The well is 13 feet deep from the ledge and contained, when measured, during the exceptional drought of the autumn 1906, water to the depth of 6½ feet. This level was just below that of the floor of the aula. In August 1909, some 7 feet of water were pumped out of the well and the clay bed examined. The water enters the well at the lowest point from the north side in 3 small streams. Excavation outside the well, to the north of the buttress, revealed a drain, just below the level of the aula floor, which formerly carried the overflow from the well. The masonry now rises 9 feet above this level. This, and the fact that the old drain has now no connection with the well, shows the masonry of the well, which is uniform, to have been entirely reconstructed, probably when the ruins were first converted into a private residence subsequent to 1662. In the masonry of the east wall can be traced a window, now filled in, measuring 4 feet 3 inches inside, with an outside width of 3 feet. The height inside was 10 feet, the sill 4 feet from the ground. The jamb of another window is shown in the end of the existing piece of wall. A third window probably occupied a corresponding position further down the wall. There was no doorway in either the east side or the north wall, the gap has been broken through, but on the west side it was possible to trace a splayed doorway, which has been filled in with masonry of probably the same date as the addition to this building on the south side. A projecting ledge of masonry 1 foot in width, and the same distance from the ground, as in the Abbey church, doubtless formed the foundation for a seat on each side of the hall. Returning to the south end of this building, almost on the site where a small arbour of iron trellis work now stands, was a tower in the end of the aula. This tower had fallen or been demolished before the wing was added, as that part of the tower represented by the dotted lines was removed to make room for the new building. The floor of this wing was found to be 4 feet 10 inches below the present surface, and at a depth of 6 feet 4 inches or 18 inches below that floor, a well-worn pebbled roadway 4½ feet wide was discovered, which originally led through the basement of the tower into the aula beyond. A rough stairway from the floor of the wing over the demolished east side of the tower covered a still older, ruined staircase, which originally led from the pebbled roadway into the turret in the wall. The blackened condition of the masonry of this turret, and the discovery of the ash pit of a stove on the other side of the pebbled way, showed that the remains of the tower had been used as a chimney. Much of the material which covers the original floor level to a depth of 6 feet 4 inches, and on which we now stand, consists of the fallen debris of this wing, which probably fell soon after the dissolution of the Abbey. For what purpose it was used, the presence of the stove would perhaps suggest distillery or brewery. The older main building with end tower, termed throughout the aula, has in many features the proportions of a church, and, were it not that the position is north-northwest by south-southeast, it might well be the original church of the Holy Saviour, on the site of which the founder, William Brewer, stipulated that the abbey was to be built. The presence of the associated buildings on the west inclines us to the opinion that this building on the east, adjoining a fresh water supply, was a Norman aula protected on the west by Gatehouse and Moat, on the south and south-east by impassable swamps, and on the north by a wall, a remnant of which stands by the present entrance to the grounds; and that the Abbey church was in reality built on the site of a former sacred edifice, perhaps, as many of the Saxon churches were, of wattle and mud. Dugdale, with what authority is not known, mentions the probability that William Brewer was born at Torre. If there is any truth in this statement, this Norman aula was the family home and birthplace of the founder of Torre Abbey. The Infirmary. Of this building nothing remains above ground. The mulberry tree, nearly 6 feet in circumference, now growing over the foundation of the east wall of the infirmary, was planted in 1826. The foundations, running north-south behind the infirmary, are of late date, and these walls were badly constructed of material taken from an older building. The Barn. The so-called Spanish barn undoubtedly dates from the earliest days of the Abbey. Transepts to north and south formed a way through which the largest waggon could be drawn to be unloaded within the barn. The walls, 3 feet thick, are strengthened on each side by 10 buttresses, 3 similar supports being built to each end. The inside measurements of this spacious garner are 119 feet long by 28 feet wide. About 2/3 of the length of the barn from the east end has been floored over to form a second storey, and cover the stabling and coach house beneath. Originally the garner was open from floor to roof. The timber framework of the roof is apparently only the second the barn has had in the 700 years of its existence. Originally there were 12 ribs, as shown by the recesses for the beam rests in the wall, and the corresponding number of buttresses outside. The slated roof is now carried by 17 ribs of what is reputed to be Spanish chestnut. The wood is exceedingly hard, and the whole roof is fastened together by wooden pins. The beams in the roof of Westminster Abbey were long thought to be of chestnut, but were proved by Dr. Lindley to be of Durmast oak. A solid block, darkened with age, fills the space of the original beam rest in the north-east corner. This is more like oak, and may be the only piece of the first roof left. The name, Spanish Barn, is undoubtedly derived from the fact that 397 prisoners from the galleon Capitana, commanded by Don Pedro de Valdez, captured from the Spanish Armada and brought into Torquay on the 26th of July, 1588, were incarcerated in this building while the vessel was being dismantled. From the account in White's History of Torquay, the prisoners appear to have been kept here for 2 or 3 weeks, when they were separated. 5 of the principal prisoners were sent to the Lord Lieutenant, who committed them to the town prison of Exeter. 166, probably the more dangerous, were put back on board and taken with the Capitana, on the 28th of August, to Dartmouth, where they were employed on Sir John Gilbert's estate at Greenway. 226, including the boys and 61 sailors, were put in the Bridewell, in a subsequent letter, dated 14th of October, termed Our House of Correction near the city of Exeter. As the number is then mentioned as 211, it is presumed that 15 had succumbed. From these figures it will be seen that certainly on this occasion no massacre or death from starvation in the barn, as has been surmised, took place. There is no recent record of human bones having been found in the immediate neighbourhood of the barn to justify belief in the massacre, the tradition concerning which is recorded in a letter written by a visitor to the Abbey about the year 1778, and mentioned by White. A round shot found in trenching north of the barn is now among the relics in the museum of the Torquay Natural History Society. The arms of Torre Abbey carved on a square stone formerly surmounted the gabled transept on the north side. Encaustic tiles. These fragments of the chancel floor are the only pieces with armorial designs found during the original excavations. 3 pieces show well the 6 fleurs-de-lis of Byley Abbey, Essex, founded 16 years before Torre. What is more remarkable, 3 chevrons, the arms of the Abbey of Tongaloo in Belgium, one of the earliest foundations of the order in 1128 and still flourishing, are clearly to be traced on a similar shield in 2 other places. The pastoral staff pattern is rather an ornamental device than an attempt to depict the arms of Torre Abbey. It is thought that many such fragments must have been found during the investigations of the Reverend McEnery, mentioned by Blewett, all account of which is unfortunately lost. The pieces here illustrated are through the kindness of Colonel Cary in the care of the Torquay Natural History Society. End of section 9. End of A Short Description of Torre Abbey, Torquay, Devonshire, by Hugh Robert Watkin.